The docking clamps hit the perihelion like a fist. Camel was 3 rungs up the maintenance ladder in the portside access shaft when the impact came, and the vibration shook him loose. He caught a handhold on the way down, wrenched his shoulder doing it, and hung there for a moment in the half-gravity of the Vethkai station's outer ring, listening to the ship settle into restraints it hadn't asked for. "Prax," he called into the comm, "tell me that was scheduled." "That was absolutely not scheduled." Prax's voice came back tight and fast, already running diagnostics. "We've got a hardline attach on the port collar. Someone just locked us in." Camel dropped the rest of the way down the ladder and moved through the corridor at a controlled jog, not running, because running on a ship meant something was on fire, and he didn't have confirmation of that yet. The recycled air tasted like scrubber chemicals and the distant ghost of whatever engineer Sira had been cooking in the galley. Normal smell. Camel had learned to read the ship by smell the same way old sailors read weather. He hit the cockpit at the same time as Sira, who had a wrench in her hand and grease on her forearm, and the particular expression of someone who had been interrupted mid-task and was deeply unhappy about it. "Vethkai docking control, this is the perihelion requesting explanation for unauthorized hard dock," Camel said into the comm, dropping into the pilot's couch. "We had a soft berth scheduled. Reference Delta 79. The response came back in the precise, layered harmonics of a Vethkai voice, 2 tones simultaneously, like someone had taught a cathedral organ to speak. The translation rig turned it into something approximating standard. "Perihelion, you have been selected for the consideration." Camel looked at Sira. Sira looked at Camel. "The what?" he said. But the line had already closed. The Vethkai had been trading partners for 11 years, which was long enough that humanity had learned the basics. They were tall, bilaterally symmetrical in ways that didn't quite match human bilateral symmetry, covered in fine iridescent filaments that served some combination of sensory and communicative functions, and deeply, profoundly hierarchical in ways that made Earth's most rigid bureaucracies look like anarchist collectives. They had 17 distinct social castes and a legal code that ran to approximately 4 million entries. They also controlled 3 jump gates and the best medical fabrication technology in this arm of the galaxy, which meant humanity was extremely motivated to learn their etiquette. Nobody had briefed Camel on anything called the consideration. The boarding tube extended 40 minutes later. Camel had used the time to pull up everything the perihelion's database had on court protocol, which was substantial, because his contract with Interstellar Commerce Authority included a diplomatic rider that was supposed to cover situations like this, and he still couldn't find a reference to the consideration. Prax had tried 3 different search strings. Nothing. "Could be a new thing," Sira said. She put the wrench away but hadn't washed the grease off, which Camel decided to read as preparedness rather than disrespect. "Everything with the Vethkai is an old thing," he said. "Their calendar goes back 40,000 years. Then it's a thing we don't have records for." The same situation, described differently, and neither description helped. The envoy who came through the boarding tube was young. Camel had gotten good at reading Vethkai age from the density and patterning of their filaments, and this ones were still growing into their full arrangement. She wore the amber and black sash of the 3rd administrative caste, which put her somewhere in the vast middle tier of Vethkai hierarchy. Her filaments were shifting through colors and patterns that the translator rig flagged as formal greeting combined with something it rendered as assessment of unknown variables. She stopped 2 meters from Camel and performed the precise bow that indicated meeting of professional equals, which surprised him enough that he nearly missed the cue to return it. "I am Velshara," she said, "attaché to the Royal Coordination Office. You are Camel, master of this vessel." "I am." "The consideration requires a human participant. Your vessel was identified by the selection matrix." Her filaments shifted. The translator rendered it as something between apology and bureaucratic necessity. "I understand this is irregular, I am authorized to explain, but the explanation is itself complex. How complex? The royal heir, she said, has requested a human companion for the Vethkai accession ceremony. Specifically, a human who does not know enough to be afraid. Camel thought about that for a moment. I'm not sure ignorance qualifies me. The alien's filaments did something he'd never seen before, a rapid oscillation that the translator, after a visible pause, rendered as amusement. You just demonstrated, Velshara said, precisely why the heir requested a human. She extended a data chip. Her filaments held steady at that amusement frequency, overlaid now with something the translator hesitantly offered as hope. Camel looked at Sira. Sira shrugged, which was the closest she ever got to encouragement. He took the chip. The perihelion's docking clamps released 30 seconds later. The ship wasn't going anywhere. They were being guided to a higher-tier berth, the kind usually reserved for diplomatic vessels, but the release felt meaningful anyway, like something had just shifted from locked to open. Camel didn't know yet whether that was good. He had a feeling he was about to find out. The Royal Coordination Office occupied a tower that had been grown rather than built. Vethkai architecture used a biological process that Camel didn't entirely understand. But the result was a structure that looked less like a building and more like something that had decided to become one. All organic curves and interlocking chambers and materials that shifted color with the station's light cycle. Velshara walked him through 7 checkpoints. At each one, his biometrics were scanned, his diplomatic rider was verified, and a different Vethkai official performed a different bow variant that indicated different things. By the 5th checkpoint, Camel had lost track of what the bows meant, which seemed to be causing some confusion among the officials because they kept looking at each other's filaments in what read as uncertainty. They're not sure what protocol applies to me, Camel said quietly to Velshara. There is no established protocol, she admitted. You are the first human to enter the coordination office. They are improvising. How do they feel about improvising? Her filaments did the amusement oscillation again. They find it deeply uncomfortable, which is, I suspect, part of why you are here. He was shown into a chamber on the building's upper level, where the walls were translucent, and the Vethkai station spread out below in all its layered complexity. The working docks at the outer ring, the administrative levels stepping inward, and at the center, the court itself, a structure so old it had been built before the station's current form and simply incorporated as the station grew around it. The heir was standing at the window. Camel had reviewed what the database said about the royal line, which wasn't much. They were extremely private about succession matters, but he'd expected someone who read as powerful in the way Vethkai hierarchy usually presented. Formal, precise, surrounded by indicators of status. The heir was none of those things. She was young, even younger than Velshara, and her filaments were in a state that the translator rendered as exhausted but controlled. She wore the minimal sash of the royal direct caste, not the elaborate layered vestments he'd expected, and she was standing with her back to the room in a way that didn't read as power. It read as someone who had been standing at that window for a long time, looking at something. She turned when Camel entered. "You're the human," she said. Her standard was precise, accent strange but clear. "I requested someone who would not understand enough to be afraid. They found you." "Camel," he said, master of the perihelion. He performed the bow he'd seen Velshara do, professional equals. It was probably wrong for the context, but it was the one he knew. Her filaments stilled. Then slowly they shifted into something the translator rendered as surprise, and the rig hesitated, something like relief. "You bow as an equal," she said. "I only know the one bow," he said. "I apologize if that's incorrect." "It is not incorrect." She moved away from the window. Up close, her filaments were more complex than he'd first registered. There were patterns in them that shifted faster than the translator could catch, subcurrents of meaning that he was reading as body language without being able to decode them. It is simply unexpected. Everyone here bows to me as a superior. Even those who dislike me do so. They have no other mode. She sat in a chair that was built for Vethkai proportions, but close enough to human that Camel could perch on a seat nearby without looking ridiculous, and looked at him with the particular attention of someone taking an inventory. "The accession ceremony," she said, "is in 4 days. When I complete it, I become the regnant heir. Every faction in this court will be positioning themselves to influence my rule." Her filaments shifted, something the translator offered as precise and controlled over something underneath that read as terrified. I required a companion for the ceremony, someone not embedded in any faction, someone who would stand beside me and not be calculating their position while they did it. "Why a human?" "Because humans," she said, "according to everything I have read, bond with strangers more readily than any other known species. You call it pack bonding. You extend loyalty to people you have known for hours." A pause. "I have known you for 6 minutes and you are already trying to figure out how to help me. I can read it in your posture." Camel considered denying it. He didn't bother. "4 days," he said. "What does the ceremony involve?" "Presentation to the High Court, a recitation of lineage, 3 formal acknowledgments from each caste." She paused. "And a spoken declaration of the companion's trust." He sat with that. "You want me to stand up in front of the entire Vethkai court and say that I trust you?" "Yes." "I've known you for 7 minutes." "Yes." He looked at her, at the filaments holding that controlled surface over the terror underneath, at the young woman who was 4 days from the most important moment of her life, and had decided that what she needed was someone who wouldn't count the cost of standing next to her. Outside, the station's light cycle shifted, and the tower's walls went briefly gold. "Tell me about the factions," Camel said. Her filaments did something new, something fast and bright that the translator, after a long pause, rendered with a single word: gratitude. She started talking. Camel took notes. Sira would tell him he was insane when she found out, and Prax would run probability calculations on his survival, and both of them would absolutely have his back anyway. "Some things you just knew about your crew." The High Court of the Vethkai Station was not designed to make humans comfortable. It was designed to make the 47 caste delegations present feel the appropriate weight of historical continuity, which meant the chamber was enormous. The acoustics were built for Vethkai harmonic voices, and every surface was covered in the accumulated symbolic language of 400 generations of Vethkai governance. Camel stood at the edge of it in borrowed formal wear. A Vethkai tailor had worked through the night on something that split the difference between human clothing and the court's requirements, and the result was strange but not offensive, and tried to remember everything Velshara had briefed him on in the past 4 days. There had been a great deal to remember. The Vethkai court politics had turned out to be something like 3-dimensional chess, played simultaneously, with 6 variants of chess, by people who had been studying the game for 40,000 years, and had extremely strong opinions about every move. The heir, her name was Savin, he'd learned, though using it directly was a Caste 3 violation, was navigating factions that wanted her to be a puppet, factions that wanted her to be a reformer, factions that had supported her mother's reign and resented the succession, and factions that had opposed her mother and saw the succession as an opportunity. Not one of them had anticipated a human. He'd spent 4 days watching Savin move through meetings with the precision and exhaustion of someone doing surgery on themselves. She was brilliant at it. He could see that, even without understanding half the filament language she deployed. But she was also running on empty in a way that no one around her seemed to notice or care about, because caring about the heir's personal state was above most castes' protocol authorization. Camel had noticed. He'd brought her coffee on the 2nd day because the perihelian's coffee was real and whatever they drank wasn't doing the job. She looked at the cup for a long moment and then drank it and said nothing, but her filaments had done the gratitude shift again, faster and brighter. Small things, the kind of small things that built the foundation of something real. Now he was standing at the threshold of the High Court, while the ceremony's first movement completed, the caste acknowledgments, 47 delegations performing their ritual recognitions in precise sequence. And he was about to go out there and do something he'd agreed to 4 days ago based on 7 minutes of conversation and a bone-deep instinct that this person needed someone in her corner. Velshara appeared at his elbow. "Are you prepared?" "No," he said. "Let's go." The walk from the threshold to the center of the chamber took approximately 40 years, subjectively. The acoustics made his footsteps sound wrong, flattened, and absorbed because the room wasn't built for human audio, but the visual impact of his presence was clearly correct because he could see filament triples moving through the assembled court like a wave. Surprise, uncertainty, calculation. The hostile faction, the coordination bloc, who had been Savin's mother's primary opposition and had already spent 3 days making clear they intended to challenge the companion's legitimacy, were in the third tier, and their filaments were very bright and very fast. Savin stood at the center of the chamber, wearing the full vestments of the royal direct caste for the first time, and she looked different in them than he'd expected. Not smaller, larger actually. Not because of the clothes, but because she'd made a decision somewhere in the last 4 days to stop holding the terror down and to hold something else up instead. She looked like someone who had decided what she was. Camel walked to the position Velshara had drilled him on, 2 steps to the right and slightly behind, the formal companion position, and stood there. The High Court was silent in the way very large, very formal spaces get silent, which is to say full of contained noise. The coordinator of records spoke, her voice layered in harmonics that the translation rig in Camel's ear rendered in real time, slightly delayed. The regnant heir presents her companion for the court's recognition. The companion will speak. This was the part. Camel had written something out. He'd revised it 6 times. Velshara had reviewed it for protocol violations and found 3, all of which he'd corrected. He'd practiced it in the perihelion's cargo bay with Sira throwing grease rags at him to improve his focus, which had helped more than he'd expected. He looked at Savin. She didn't look back, protocol required her to face the High Coordinator, but her filaments shifted in a single brief motion that the translator caught as, "Ready." "I am Camel," he said, and his voice came out steady, because he'd been on enough ships in enough bad situations to know that the moment you let your voice shake, you'd already half lost. "Master of the vessel Perihelion. I came to this station 3 weeks ago on a cargo contract, and I met the heir 7 days ago." The coordination block's filaments went very bright. "I know this is irregular," he continued. "I've been informed it's irregular approximately 40 times in the past week. I don't have a caste. I don't have a position in your hierarchy. I'm a working spacer from a planet that your records probably still classify as a developing system." He paused. 7 days ago, this person asked me to stand here and tell you that I trust her. I want to tell you what she's like so you understand what that means." The chamber was very quiet. "She is rigorous," he said. "I watched her work through factional negotiations for 4 days, and she never cut a corner and she never lost track of what she was actually trying to do. She drank coffee at 2 in the morning and kept going. She asked me questions about how humans handle political pressure, and she listened to the answers even when they didn't fit what she expected." He looked at the assembled court. She could have found a more impressive companion, someone with credentials. Someone who understood your protocols. She found me because she wanted someone who would stand next to her and not be running calculations while they did it. He looked at Savin. She still hadn't looked back at him, but her filaments were doing something he'd never seen before, a full-body pattern, slow and complex, that the translator didn't even attempt to render. "I trust her," he said. Not because I'm required to, not because of her title, because I spent 7 days watching her try to do right by her people while everyone around her was trying to position themselves, and she is the only one in this building who didn't ask me for anything except to show up. Silence. Then, from somewhere in the upper tiers, a single delegation performed the acknowledgement bow. Then another. Then they came in sequence, not the clean choreographed sequence of the formal ceremony, but something ragged and real, spreading through the court like the cargo ship's hull vibration that told a pilot the drive had caught. The coordination block did not bow. They didn't need to. There were 43 delegations that did. Savin turned and looked at him. Her filaments were doing something so complex that the translator simply output, unable to render, multiple simultaneous emotional registers. Camel figured he could read the room well enough without the translation. "Well," he said, quietly enough that only she could hear, "you've got a court." "We," she said. Her standard was precise and her accent was strange, and the word carried more weight than one syllable should be able to hold. 2 hours later, the perihelion's engines were warmed and the docking clamps were releasing, not because they were leaving, but because Savin had authorized the perihelion a permanent diplomatic berth, which meant the ship could come and go as its crew required. Prax had already pulled up the trade route data for the station. Sira had identified 3 separate maintenance jobs she could bid on in the working docks. The crew had opinions about things, and Camel had learned long ago not to get in the way of the crew having opinions. He stood in the cockpit with coffee going cold in his hand, watching the station through the port window. The court tower was lit amber gold in the station's evening cycle. Somewhere up there, a new regnant air was beginning whatever came next. Velshara had sent him a message before the ceremony ended. The translation rig had taken 3 attempts to render it and finally produced. The court models you as an anomaly. They cannot predict your behavior because you did not calculate your position. This is unprecedented. They find it alarming. And then the air finds it remarkable. Camel drank the cold coffee. Outside, the stars were the same stars they'd always been, indifferent, infinite, and lit by the kind of light that took years to arrive. Sira appeared in the cockpit doorway. "So," she said, "are we staying?" "For a while," he said. She nodded once. The way Sira nodded when she'd already figured something out and was just waiting for confirmation. Then she went back to whatever she'd been doing, and the ship hummed around them both, recycled air and engine vibration, and the smell of whatever was burning gently in the galley, steady and real and still flying. Some ships just knew when they'd found their heading. The perihelion held its berth and waited for what came next, and what came next was a long story, and the crew was ready for it.